When Monique Richardson is denied a $500 loan to save her 7-year-old son from a dangerous infection, wealthy developer Eric Johnson hears her quiet pain through a thin bank wall and is forced to confront a heartbreaking truth. While the bank trusted him with $2.3 million in minutes, it refused to see the exhausted mother holding a yellow envelope, an innocent child hiding his pain, and a family being crushed by a debt that was never theirs. Monique Richardson had practiced asking for $500 since before sunrise. She repeated the explanation in the bathroom mirror, at the bus stop, and during the ride downtown. She needed the money to treat her 7-year-old son's infected tooth before the infection spread. By the time she entered the bank, she had trained her voice not to shake. She believed that if she stayed calm and explained everything clearly, someone might understand. The bank cubicle was small, with gray fabric walls that barely blocked the sound from the next desk. Monique wore a navy blazer, borrowed from her elderly neighbor, Gwendolyn. It was too large around the shoulders, but Gwendolyn had pressed it carefully and told her to walk into the bank like she belonged there. Monique held a yellow envelope against her chest. Inside were pay stubs from 2 jobs, her apartment lease, her children's birth certificates, divorce papers, hospital records, and a repayment plan she had written by hand. On the other side of the thin partition, Eric Johnson was signing documents for a $2.3 million construction loan. His paperwork had already been approved, printed, and marked with colored tabs. A fresh cup of coffee waited beside his leather folder. Eric had borrowed millions from the bank before, so no one questioned whether he could be trusted. All he needed to do was sign his name several times and leave. Ms. Patel entered Monique's information into the computer. In the screen showed a credit score of 503, 2 part-time jobs, no savings, and an unpaid hospital bill. It did not show how many hours Monique worked each week or how often she skipped meals so her children could eat. It did not show that her son slept with one hand pressed against his swollen cheek. It only showed numbers, balances, and the word risk. Ms. Patel opened the yellow envelope but barely looked at the documents Monique had spent the entire night arranging. She glanced at one pay stub, then returned to the computer. Monique watched her face and understood what was coming before the woman spoke. "I can see that you worked hard to prepare all of this," Ms. Patel said, "but your application does not meet the bank's requirements." Monique placed her handwritten repayment plan on the desk. She had listed how much she could pay every week after rent, food, and bus fare. "I have 2 jobs, and I can repay it in small amounts. I'm not asking for money to buy something for myself. My son has an infection under a broken tooth. He wakes up at night in pain, but he tries not to make any noise because he thinks I need the sleep." Her words passed through the thin wall. Eric's pen stopped above the page. $500 was less than the price of the watch on his wrist, yet the woman beside him was explaining why her child could not wait for treatment. In front of Eric sat a loan worth millions, approved without hesitation. Only a few inches away, a mother was struggling to borrow enough money to stop her son's pain. Ms. Patel looked at Monique's repayment plan. The careful rows of numbers showed that Monique understood exactly where every dollar went. She was not careless or irresponsible. She was simply living a life with no room for an emergency. Still, the red message remained on the computer screen. "I believe you," Ms. Patel said quietly, "but the system will not allow me to approve the loan." Monique looked directly at her. "Believing me and helping me are not the same thing." For a moment, Ms. Patel had no answer. Monique understood that the conversation was over. The computer had already decided who she was without knowing anything about her former husband, the debts opened in her name, or the years she had spent paying bills she never created. The system did not know her story, it only knew her score. Monique carefully returned every document to the yellow envelope. She placed the birth certificates inside their plastic sleeve and straightened the hospital papers so their corners would not bend. Her hands trembled, but she moved slowly because she refused to fall apart in that room. Then she stood, adjusted the borrowed blazer, and held the envelope against her chest. "Thank you for your time," she said. Eric heard the chair slide across the carpet. He heard the papers rustling inside the envelope and Monique's footsteps moving toward the front doors. Most of all, he heard her thank the bank after it had denied her the money she needed for her child. The words stayed with him because they sounded exactly like something his own mother would have said. At the glass doors, Monique stopped for 3 seconds. She placed one hand against the glass and tried to steady her breathing. In a few hours, she would have to look into her son's swollen face and tell him the bank had not helped them. She did not know what they would do next. Then she pushed the door open and walked outside. Mr. Whitfield placed the final document in front of Eric. One more signature, and the full $2.3 million is ready. Eric looked at the number printed across the page. The bank had approved millions for him in minutes because it knew his buildings, his accounts, and his financial history. It had denied a mother $500 because it knew only a number on a screen. Between them stood a wall only a few inches thick, but it separated two completely different worlds. Eric signed the final page, but for the first time in his career, approval did not feel like success. It felt like evidence. Monique woke before the alarm because the living room had already begun to turn cold. She had fallen asleep on the couch with one arm hanging toward the floor and the thin blanket twisted around her legs. The apartment had only one bedroom, and she had given it to Deshawn and Kesha. She told people the couch was comfortable enough, but most mornings she woke with a stiff back and numb fingers. None of that mattered as long as her children had a real bed. Before getting up, she listened for a moment to make sure they were still sleeping. The kitchen was only a few steps from the couch. Monique opened the refrigerator and counted what was left: 3 eggs, 4 slices of bread, a little milk, and half a jar of peanut butter. She cracked 2 eggs into the pan and saved the third for the next morning. She toasted the bread and cut each slice in half so the table would look fuller. There was enough food for 2 children if she was careful. She did not make anything for herself. Deshawn entered the kitchen with his backpack already on. At 7 years old, he had learned to get dressed without being reminded and to keep his shoes near the door so his mother would not have to search for them. Kesha followed behind him, still sleepy and dragging her blanket across the floor. Monique placed 1 plate in front of each child and poured the remaining milk into 2 small cups. She stood by the counter with a glass of water. Deshawn looked at the table, then at his mother's empty hands. "You already ate, Mama?" he asked. Monique gave him the same easy smile she used every morning. "I ate before you woke up." Deshawn knew it was not true. The pan was still warm, and there was no dirty plate in the sink. He looked down at his breakfast, but did not argue. Instead, he cut his egg in half and pushed 1 piece onto an empty saucer near the center of the table. He tried to make the movement look casual, but Monique noticed. "I'm full," he said. "You should eat it so we don't waste food." "You need it more than I do," Monique replied. "You're still growing." Deshawn looked up at her. "You're growing too, Mama. You're growing enough to carry all of us." Monique turned toward the sink before he could see her face. She picked up a clean glass and ran water over it, even though it did not need washing. Behind her, she heard Kesha eating and Deshawn quietly moving the saucer closer to the edge of the table. Monique waited until she could breathe normally again. Then she picked up the half egg and ate it standing beside the sink. Deshawn returned to his breakfast, chewing slowly on the right side of his mouth. The left side of his face was swollen, though he tried to hide it by keeping his head turned. Every time he bit down, his shoulders tightened for a second. He never cried and never asked to stop eating. He had already learned that pain made his mother worried, and worry sometimes made her miss work, so he kept chewing as if nothing was wrong. Monique sat beside him and gently touched his cheek. It felt warmer than the other side. "Tell me the truth. How bad is it this morning?" Deshawn lowered his eyes. "Only a little. I know how to handle it." Those words frightened her more than tears would have. A 7-year-old should not know how to handle pain. He should complain, ask to stay home, and expect an adult to make everything better. Instead, he was trying to make himself smaller so his mother would have one less problem to carry. Monique kissed the top of his head and promised herself that she would find the $500 somehow. Kesha leaned across the table and studied her brother's face. "Does it still hurt?" Deshaun forced a small smile. "Not when I don't think about it." Kesha reached over and held his hand while she finished her toast. Monique watched them sitting together at the small table, one child pretending not to hurt and the other pretending to believe him. For a moment, she wished they could simply be children. She wished breakfast could be about spilled milk, unfinished homework, and arguments over the last piece of toast. Instead, even the quietest moments in their home had begun to revolve around money and pain. Before they left, Deshaun slipped the empty saucer into the sink. He believed that by giving his mother half an egg, he had helped solve something. Monique did not tell him that the real problem was much larger than breakfast. She buttoned his jacket, adjusted Kesha's backpack, and led them toward the door. As they stepped into the hallway, Deshaun took his mother's hand with one hand and pressed the other against his swollen cheek. Monique locked the apartment behind them and held his hand a little tighter. She had been denied at the bank, but she could not allow that answer to become the end of their story. Her son was already learning to live around pain. She would not let him become so good at hiding it that the world stopped noticing. That morning, there had been only 2 plates on the table. But somehow, the smallest person in the room had still found a way to feed his mother. The yellow envelope Monique carried into the bank had belonged to her mother, Odessa. Its corners were soft, and a strip of old tape ran across the bottom where the paper had once split. Odessa had used it to store the documents she considered too important to lose: her birth certificate, social security card, apartment lease, and the records from nearly 30 years of work. After Odessa died, Monique found the envelope on the kitchen table beside 5 smaller ones. Each had been labeled in her mother's careful handwriting: rent, food, electricity, bus fare, and emergency. Every other Friday, Odessa sat at that table and divided her paycheck by hand. She counted the bills twice before placing them into the envelopes, always starting with rent and ending with emergencies. Sometimes the emergency envelope received only $5. Sometimes it received nothing at all. Odessa would press the flap closed anyway, as if an empty envelope could still be a promise that the family would survive the next unexpected problem. When Monique was 12, her mother taught her how to divide the money. She explained that food could be stretched, lights could be turned off, and worn shoes could last another month if they were kept dry. Odessa never complained about having too little. She treated every problem like a set of numbers that could be rearranged until the answer became possible. Whenever Monique asked what happened if there was simply not enough, her mother always gave the same answer: don't wait for someone to open a door for you. If there isn't one, find another way through. Monique grew up believing those words were a lesson in strength. Odessa never borrowed money, missed work, or admitted that she was afraid. She worked as a nursing assistant, lifting patients heavier than she was, and standing for hours until her feet became swollen. Even when her back hurt, she put on her uniform and caught the first bus before sunrise. She told Monique that needing help gave other people the power to decide whether you deserved it. Years later, Odessa began having chest pains. She felt them while climbing stairs, carrying groceries, and getting dressed for work. Instead of telling anyone, she took aspirin and sat quietly until the pain passed. She did not call Monique because her daughter was raising 2 small children and already struggling in her marriage. Odessa believed that asking for help would place one more burden on a person who was carrying too much. Monique found her mother on a Sunday afternoon. Odessa was sitting at the kitchen table with the 5 envelopes spread in front of her. A pen remained between her fingers, and the emergency envelope was still open. Inside were $43, Not enough for an ambulance, a doctor, or the weeks of treatment she might have needed. Monique later learned that Odessa had probably been experiencing warning signs for more than a month. For a long time, Monique called her mother strong because that was easier than admitting the truth. Odessa had been afraid of becoming a burden. She had carried that fear so quietly that even her daughter had mistaken it for independence. Her refusal to ask for help had protected her pride, but it had also left her alone when her body could no longer keep going. The lesson that had helped Odessa survive poverty may also have prevented her from surviving her illness. After the funeral, Monique took the yellow envelope home. She placed her own documents inside it, including her divorce papers, credit reports, and her children's birth certificates. Over time, the envelope stopped being a record of Odessa's life and became a record of everything Monique had lost. It held the debt created in her name, the marriage that had failed, and the numbers that followed her into every job application, apartment office, and bank. On the morning of the loan appointment, Monique stood alone in the bathroom wearing Gwendolyn's borrowed blazer. The children were still asleep, and the apartment was quiet except for the old refrigerator humming in the kitchen. She held the envelope against her chest and looked at herself in the mirror. For years, she had followed her mother's rule. She had worked more hours, skipped meals, paid debts that were not hers, and found a way through every closed door without asking anyone to open it. But Deshawn's swollen face had changed something. Monique could endure hunger, exhaustion, and humiliation when the pain belonged to her. She could not continue watching her son pretend that his tooth did not hurt. For the first time, finding another way meant admitting that she had reached the limit of what she could do alone. The thought frightened her more than the bank, the application, or the possibility of being rejected. Monique closed her eyes and remembered her mother counting money at the kitchen table. She imagined Odessa standing beside her, still wearing her faded work uniform and still insisting that strong people did not ask. Monique tightened her arms around the envelope. Then she spoke in a whisper so her children would not hear. "You taught me to find my own way, Mama. Today, I'm going to knock on one door first." The words felt almost like a betrayal. But as Monique looked at the old envelope, she understood that breaking her mother's rule did not mean she loved her any less. It meant she had finally seen what the rule had cost them both. Odessa had spent her life proving that she could carry everything alone. Monique no longer wanted her children to believe love meant hiding pain until it was too late. She slipped the envelope beneath her arm and walked out of the bathroom. Before leaving, she stood in the bedroom doorway and watched Deshawn sleeping with one hand against his cheek. Kesha was curled beside him, holding the edge of his blanket. Monique knew the bank might still say no. But that morning, for the first time in her life, she would allow another person to see that she needed help. The envelope had once held the proof that Odessa existed. Now it carried the proof that Monique was ready to live differently. The accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon during recess. Deshawn tripped over a raised piece of pavement and struck his mouth against the metal railing beside the playground ramp. When the school nurse called Monique, she was cleaning a motel room across town. She left before finishing her shift, knowing 2 hours would be taken from her paycheck. By the time she reached the school, the bleeding had stopped, but Deshawn's upper lip was swollen and one of his teeth had cracked near the gum. He was sitting quietly in the nurse's office with a towel pressed against his mouth. Monique knelt in front of him and checked his face with trembling hands. Deshawn told her he was fine, but she could see the fear in his eyes. He had not cried in front of the nurse because he thought crying would make the situation worse. At the emergency room, they waited nearly 4 hours before a doctor examined him. The crack had reached beneath the gum line and the tissue around it was already inflamed. The doctor prescribed antibiotics and gave Monique a list of pediatric dental offices. The emergency room could control the infection for a short time, but it could not fix the tooth. Deshawn needed a dental procedure before the infection spread deeper into his jaw. The first private clinic Monique contacted could see him within 3 days. The procedure would take less than half an hour, but the clinic required $500 before treatment. Monique asked about a payment plan, insurance assistance, and partial payment. The answer to each question was no. The next morning, she sat at the kitchen table with the referral list, her phone, and a pen. Deshaun was in the bedroom trying to finish his homework, and Kesha was coloring on the floor beside him. Monique called the first dental office and explained the injury. The receptionist asked what kind of insurance Deshaun had. When Monique said Medicaid, there was a brief silence before the woman offered an appointment 8 weeks away. Monique thanked her and called the next number. The second office had a 10-week wait. The third could not see him for almost 3 months. The fourth was no longer accepting new Medicaid patients, and the fifth said its emergency appointments were already filled. One number had been disconnected. At every office, Monique repeated the same story about the broken tooth, the swelling, and the antibiotics. Each time she tried to sound calm because she believed people listened more carefully when desperation was hidden. By the 7th call, her voice no longer sounded steady. The receptionist said the earliest available appointment was 12 weeks away. Monique looked toward the bedroom, where Deshaun was pressing one hand against his cheek while helping Kesha sharpen a crayon. He was 7 years old and already trying to hide his pain so the adults around him would not worry. Monique tightened her grip on the phone. "My son cannot wait 3 months," she said. "The doctor told me the infection could spread." The receptionist apologized and said the schedule was completely full. Monique closed her eyes. She had heard almost the same answer 7 times, delivered in the same careful voice. "When you say you understand, do you mean you understand as a mother? Or is that simply what you were trained to tell people like me?" The line became quiet. For the first time that morning, the receptionist stopped typing. Her voice softened when she spoke again. She admitted that she had children of her own and that she was sorry, but she still had no appointment to offer. She gave Monique the number of another community clinic, though she warned that it usually had a long line. It was not the answer Monique needed, but it was the first time someone had spoken to her like a person instead of another name on a waiting list. After the call ended, Monique placed the phone on the table and covered her face with both hands. She did not hear Deshaun enter the kitchen. He had been standing near the doorway long enough to understand that the problem was not finding a dentist. The problem was money. His 8th birthday was 2 weeks away, and Monique had promised him a small cake from the grocery store and a new set of colored pencils. It was not much, but he had been talking about it for months. "You don't have to buy the cake," he said. Monique quickly wiped her eyes and turned toward him. Deshaun stood with one hand against his swollen cheek. He explained that he did not need a party, candles, or colored pencils. He had heard her mention the $500 and believed giving up his birthday might help. Then he said the words no child should ever have to say. "Use the cake money for my tooth. I can turn 8 without a cake." Monique pulled him into her arms before he could see her expression change. She held him carefully, afraid of touching the swollen side of his face. Deshaun wrapped his arms around her waist and told her he did not mind. Behind his back, Monique's hands began to shake. The birthday cake would have cost less than $20, but her son believed he had found a way to save them. She wanted to tell him that children were supposed to make wishes on their birthdays, not cancel them to pay medical bills. She wanted to promise that the dentist would fix everything and that he would have his cake. Instead, she kissed the top of his head and told him the only truth she could manage. His birthday was not the problem, and neither was he. That night, Deshaun fell asleep with his mouth slightly open because closing it increased the pressure around the tooth. Monique sat beside him and rubbed clove oil gently along his swollen gum. The relief would last less than an hour, but it was the only thing she could give him. Kesha slept beside him with one hand resting on his arm. Monique watched both children breathe and felt the $500 standing between her son and a night without pain. 7 offices had closed their doors. The next morning, Monique decided she would knock on an 8th. When Monique first met Darius, he seemed like the kind of man who made life easier. He remembered small things, opened doors, and always knew what to say when she was tired or worried. After they married, He offered to handle the bills so she could focus on the children and her bookkeeping job. At first, it felt like love. The mail disappeared from the table before she came home, the accounts were paid online, and Darius always told her not to worry. Monique believed they were sharing responsibilities. She did not realize he was slowly removing her from every part of their financial life. Darius controlled the passwords, bank statements, and credit card accounts. When Monique asked to see the monthly budget, he told her she already had enough to think about. He said he was protecting her from stress, and she wanted to believe him. She was raising 2 small children, working full-time, and trying to keep their home peaceful. His control did not look cruel from the outside. It looked helpful. That was what made it so difficult to recognize. He opened 4 credit cards in Monique's name without telling her. He used her social security number, copied her signature, and sent the statements to an online account only he could access. The charges began small, then grew into cash advances, electronics, travel, and personal expenses. Over time, the balance reached tens of thousands of dollars. Darius always paid just enough to keep the accounts from drawing attention. While Monique believed he was building their savings, he was quietly destroying her credit. Then one Wednesday, Darius left. He took his clothes, laptop, and the car they had shared. He did not leave a note or explain where he was going. Monique spent the first night believing he would return after he calmed down. 2 weeks later, the collection letters began arriving. There were past due notices, final warnings, and balances from accounts she had never seen. Every envelope carried her name. At first, Monique thought there had been a mistake. She called the companies one by one and explained that she had never opened the accounts. Each representative asked questions only Darius would have known how to answer. Her name, address, social security number, and signature were all on the applications. To the companies, the documents looked real. To Monique, they looked like proof that the person she had trusted most had been living another life behind her back. She finally reached Darius by phone after leaving dozens of messages. He sounded calm, almost annoyed that she had disturbed him. Monique stood in the kitchen with the collection letters spread across the table and asked how he could have done it. He did not apologize. Instead, he tried to make her believe the debt belonged to both of them. "You used my name to build another life," Monique said. "You lived in that house too," Darius replied. "You benefited while we were married." Monique stared at the bills in front of her. "I benefited from accounts I never saw and debts I never agreed to." Darius ended the call before she could say anything else. Monique stood alone in the kitchen with the phone still pressed against her ear. Deshawn was 3 years old, Kesha was still a baby, and both children were sleeping in the next room. She wanted to scream, but she was afraid of waking them. Instead, she sat down and began reading every page, trying to understand how much of her life had been taken without her knowledge. Within 2 months, her credit score fell from the 700s to below 500. The number followed her everywhere. Her employer ran a routine background check and questioned whether someone with severe financial problems could continue handling company accounts. Monique explained the forged signatures and the marriage, but the company did not want to wait for an investigation. She lost the bookkeeping job she had held for years. The skills that once made her reliable no longer mattered because the report said she could not be trusted. A few months later, her landlord refused to renew the lease after checking her credit. Monique packed the apartment while Deshawn watched from the hallway. He asked why they had to leave, and she told him the new apartment would be closer to the bus. She did not tell him that no landlord wanted to rent to her. She did not tell him that his father had taken their financial future with him. She carried boxes down the stairs while holding Kesha against her chest, trying to make the move feel like a choice. Monique filed disputes with the credit bureaus and reported the identity theft. Every office asked for proof that she had not signed the applications. She had police reports, divorce records, and samples of her real signature, but the process moved slowly. Each new form required another document, another call, and another explanation of the same betrayal. She often spent her lunch breaks on hold, then returned to work without eating. The system demanded time and money from a woman who had almost none of either. The collection agencies continued calling. Some threatened lawsuits, wage garnishment, and further damage to her credit. Monique knew the debt was not hers, but she also knew that refusing to pay could make it harder to rent an apartment or keep a bank account. She began sending small monthly payments while the disputes remained open. $20 here, $50 there, whatever she could take from groceries, clothes, or transportation. She paid because she was afraid that fighting too hard might cost her children the little stability they still had. Over 3 years, Monique paid almost $19,000 toward accounts she had never opened. That money could have bought food, school supplies, medical care, or a safer apartment. Instead, it disappeared into debts created by a man who was living in another city with a clean record and a new job. Monique worked 2 part-time jobs while his name remained untouched. Every payment protected him from the damage he had placed on her life. The worst part was not losing the money. It was watching a number change the way people looked at her. Employers saw risk, landlords saw trouble, banks saw someone who could not be trusted. No one saw the woman who paid bills that were not hers because she was trying to keep a roof over her children's heads. Her credit score did not measure her honesty. It measured how much damage another person had been allowed to do in her name. By the time Monique asked the bank for $500, she had already paid thousands toward someone else's choices. She was not asking for charity. She was asking for a small chance to protect her son. But the same system that had failed to stop Darius from stealing her identity now used the damage he caused as a reason to deny her help. The debt did not belong to Monique, but every locked door did. Eric Johnson lived on the top floor of a converted warehouse overlooking the bay. The apartment had tall windows, polished floors, and more space than one person could use. Everything had been chosen carefully, from the expensive coffee machine to the artwork on the walls. Nothing was broken, crowded, or out of place. From the outside, it looked like the life of a man who had everything. Most nights, however, the only sound inside was the refrigerator turning on and off. A long dining table stood near the windows with 6 matching chairs around it. Eric had bought the table when his daughter, Brianna, was 13 and the family still ate dinner together. His wife had sat at one end, Brianna beside her, while Eric usually arrived late and reheated whatever they had saved for him. After the divorce, Brianna stopped visiting as often, and the chairs remained pushed neatly beneath the table. 5 of them had not been used in more than a year. Eric cleaned around them without ever asking why he still kept so many seats. Brianna now attended college across the country. She called every few weeks, usually between classes, and their conversations rarely lasted longer than 10 minutes. Eric asked about grades, housing, and whether she needed money. Brianna asked about his projects because she knew work was the only subject that kept him talking. They both avoided the questions that mattered. Distance had made it easier to speak, but not easier to be honest. Years earlier, Brianna had performed in a school concert she had practiced for months. Eric promised he would be there, but a meeting with investors ran late. Instead of leaving the meeting, he paid someone to record the concert and sent flowers backstage. He watched the video alone after midnight, then told himself the recording meant he had not truly missed it. Brianna never mentioned the flowers. What she remembered was looking into the audience and seeing an empty chair beside her mother. During one of their brief phone calls, Eric tried to explain that he had attended every graduation, birthday dinner, and important appointment he could. Brianna listened quietly before answering. "You saved every important date in your calendar, Dad. You just never lived inside any of them." Eric had no response because he knew she was right. He had always believed providing for his family was the same as being present. By the time he understood the difference, the family he had worked to protect no longer felt like a family. Eric had built his company the same way he built his apartment. Every cost was calculated, every deadline was controlled, and every possible risk was identified before construction began. People trusted him because he rarely made mistakes. He had spent most of his life making sure he would never need to depend on anyone. What he had not noticed was that independence had slowly become isolation. He owned buildings full of families, but returned each night to a home where no one was waiting. That was why Monique's voice affected him at the bank. It was not only the request for $500 or the story about her son's infection. It was the control in her voice, the way she kept every word steady even when fear was underneath it. She sounded like someone who had practiced asking until it no longer sounded like asking. Eric recognized that effort because his mother had spoken the same way whenever she needed something she expected to be denied. Monique never raised her voice or tried to make the loan officer feel guilty. She explained what had happened, showed a repayment plan, and waited for someone to see more than the number on the screen. When the answer remained no, she thanked the woman and left. That quiet dignity stayed with Eric more than anger would have. He had heard people demand millions with less humility than Monique had shown while asking for $500. As Eric sat in his apartment that evening, he looked at the 6 empty chairs and heard Monique's voice again. He thought about Brianna sitting in an audience and searching for him. He thought about his mother hiding her own needs so no one would see her struggle. For years, Eric had believed silence meant strength, and success meant he had escaped the life he came from. Now he began to wonder how many people he had failed to notice while protecting himself from needing anyone. The thin wall at the bank had kept Eric from seeing Monique's face, but her voice had reached a part of him that money, distance, and 6 empty chairs had never been able to hide. 31 years earlier, Eric was 10 years old and living with his mother Beverly in a small apartment near the hotel where she worked. That fall, his school announced a new dress code requiring khaki pants, a white polo shirt, and black shoes. The uniform cost $200, more than Beverly had left after paying rent and utilities. Eric told her he could wear his old clothes and accept the punishment, but she refused. She had spent years making sure poverty never embarrassed her son in public. Beverly had worked in hotel housekeeping for 9 years without missing a shift. She cleaned 14 rooms a day, pushed a heavy cart through long hallways, and often came home with pain in her back and hands. She went to her supervisor and asked for a $200 advance from her next paycheck. She promised he could deduct it in full and reminded him that she had never been late. He barely looked up before telling her company policy did not allow advances. Beverly found the money by selling her winter coat, borrowing from a neighbor, and collecting bottles for cash. On Monday morning, Eric walked into school wearing the required uniform. He could see that the shoes pinched her feet because they had been bought 1 size too small at a discount, but he did not complain. Beverly stood at the door and smiled as he left. Neither of them knew that asking for help had made her visible to the wrong people. 2 weeks later, the hotel fired Beverly during what management called restructuring. She returned home carrying a cardboard box, but hid it before Eric arrived from school. The next morning, she put on her uniform at the usual time and left the apartment. She continued doing this every weekday for 3 weeks. While Eric believed she was cleaning hotel rooms, Beverly spent each day walking through the city looking for work. She came home at the same time every afternoon and asked about school, as though nothing had changed. She still checked his homework, cooked dinner, and prepared her uniform for the next day. Eric noticed that she looked more tired, but he assumed the hotel had become busier. He did not know she often skipped lunch because she needed the money for bus fare. Beverly was trying to protect him from a fear she believed was too heavy for a child. One evening, Eric took out the trash and found her uniform folded neatly inside a plastic bag at the bottom of the can. It had not been thrown away carelessly. The buttons were fastened, the sleeves were straight, and her name tag rested on top. Eric carried it into the kitchen and placed it on the table. Beverly looked at the uniform and knew there was no reason to pretend anymore. "You don't work there now, do you?" Eric asked. Beverly shook her head and said she was looking for another hallway to walk down. When he asked whether she was afraid, she admitted that she was. Then she placed both hands on his shoulders and told him he did not have to be afraid with her that day. Eric nodded, though he already was. It was the first time he understood that adults could be frightened and still get dressed every morning. Beverly eventually found work cleaning private homes. The pay was lower, the hours were longer, and there were no benefits. After being fired, she never asked an employer for anything again. She did not ask for a raise, a day off, or help when her back pain became worse. She believed needing something made a person easy to remove. Years later, when Eric's business became successful, he bought his mother a better apartment and sent her money every month. He believed that providing for her meant she would never struggle again. What he did not know was that Beverly had begun suffering from chest pain. She hid it because asking her son to take her to a doctor felt like admitting she could no longer manage her own life. Beverly died from a heart attack while cleaning someone else's kitchen. By then, Eric had enough money to pay for any specialist, hospital, or treatment she might have needed. None of it mattered because she had never told him she was sick. For years, Eric blamed himself for failing to notice. He also admired his mother for never asking anyone to carry her burdens. After hearing Monique at the bank, that admiration began to feel different. Sitting alone in his car, Eric remembered the folded uniform and the pain his mother had hidden until it killed her. Beverly had taught him to work hard, protect his family, and depend on no one. But she had also taught him that needing help should be hidden. Eric rested his hands on the steering wheel and finally said aloud what he had avoided for years. "My mother didn't teach me strength. She taught me to disappear whenever I needed someone." On the other side of the bank wall, Monique had sounded just like Beverly. She had controlled her fear, explained her need, and thanked the people who refused her. Eric now understood why her voice had stayed with him. He had heard his mother asking for $200 all over again, and once again, he had done nothing. After Ms. Patel denied the loan, Monique placed every document back inside the yellow envelope. She moved slowly, making sure the hospital papers and birth certificates did not bend. Her hands were shaking, but she kept them close to her body so no one would notice. Then she stood, thanked the loan officer, and walked toward the front of the bank. She could feel people moving around her, but she kept her eyes on the glass doors. When Monique reached the exit, she stopped with one hand against the glass. For 3 seconds, she did not move. She had spent the entire morning controlling her voice, her breathing, and the fear that had been growing inside her since Deshawn's accident. Now, she pictured him sitting at the kitchen table with his hand against his swollen cheek, waiting to hear whether she had found the money. She did not know what she would tell him. Monique closed her eyes and took one slow breath. Crying inside the bank would not change the answer, and falling apart outside would not take away her son's pain. She pressed the envelope against her chest, pushed open the door, and stepped into the morning. The bus stop was only a few feet from the entrance. She stood beneath the route sign and waited, still wearing Gwendolyn's borrowed blazer. Eric left the bank several minutes later with the documents for his $2.3 million loan inside a leather folder. His banker had shaken his hand, congratulated him, and told him the funds would be available on schedule. Everything had gone exactly as planned, but Eric felt no satisfaction. When he walked outside, he saw Monique standing at the bus stop. He recognized the yellow envelope before he recognized anything else. She stood with her back straight and her eyes fixed on the road. One hand held the envelope, while the other gripped the strap of her worn handbag. Eric slowed down. He could have walked over, introduced himself, and told her he had heard the conversation. He could have asked whether there was any way he could help. Instead, he continued toward his car. As Eric crossed the parking lot, he began giving himself reasons not to approach her. She was a stranger. She might feel embarrassed knowing that he had heard private details about her life. She might believe he was looking down on her or trying to make himself feel important. He did not know her name, where she lived, or whether she wanted help from anyone. Each reason sounded sensible enough to let him keep walking. Eric reached his car and placed the leather folder on the passenger seat. Through the windshield, he could still see Monique at the bus stop. The city bus had not arrived, and she had not moved. He considered getting out, but then imagined the awkward conversation and the possibility that she would reject him. He started the engine instead. As he drove away, Eric told himself that respecting her privacy was the right choice. Deep down, he knew it was not respect that had stopped him. It was discomfort. Helping her would have required him to step into a painful situation he did not understand, and driving away required nothing. He had chosen the easier option and dressed it up as good manners. At the next traffic light, Eric looked in the rearview mirror, but the bank was already out of sight. The image of Monique waiting for the bus remained with him. He thought about how long she had probably traveled to reach the bank and how quickly the system had sent her back home with nothing. Her request had taken less than 15 minutes to deny. The trip itself had likely taken hours. That evening, Eric returned to his apartment and placed the loan documents on the dining table. The 6 chairs were neatly arranged, and the room looked exactly as it had that morning. He poured a drink, but left it untouched. Every time he tried to review the construction schedule, he heard Monique saying that her son had an infection. Then he heard her thanking the bank after it refused to help. Eric picked up his phone and called Brianna. It was not one of the Sundays when they normally spoke, so she answered with concern and asked whether something had happened. Eric almost said everything was fine. That was the answer he usually gave when he did not know how to begin an honest conversation. This time, he told her about the woman at the bank. He did not mention Monique's name because he did not know it. He explained that she needed $500 for her son and had been denied while he was signing a loan for millions. He admitted that he had seen her outside and had chosen not to approach her. Brianna listened without interrupting. When Eric finished, the silence between them felt more honest than most of their conversations. "What would you do if you saw someone drowning, but didn't know whether they wanted to be rescued?" Eric asked. Brianna thought for a moment before answering. "I wouldn't jump in and drag them somewhere they never asked to go. I'd ask whether they needed a life jacket or just someone to stay beside them." Eric looked at the empty chairs around the table. For most of his life, he had believed help meant taking control of a problem and solving it with money. He knew how to finance buildings, hire experts, and remove obstacles. He did not know how to stand beside someone without deciding what they needed. Brianna's answer showed him that the first step was not rescue. It was listening. Before ending the call, Brianna told him something else. She said feeling guilty would not help the woman or her child. If he truly wanted to do something, he needed to stop making the situation about his own regret. Eric thanked her, and this time the conversation did not end after 10 minutes. They remained on the phone a little longer, speaking more honestly than they had in years. Afterward, Eric sat alone at the table and looked at the leather folder. Inside was proof that the bank trusted him with $2.3 million. Somewhere across the city, a mother was returning home to tell her son she could not borrow $500. The difference between them was not character, effort, or love for their families. The difference was that the system knew how to say yes to a man like Eric. He remembered Monique standing at the glass door for 3 seconds before walking outside. At the time, he had thought she was simply pausing. Now he understood that she had been gathering enough strength to face whatever came next. Eric had seen that moment and still walked away. He could not return to the parking lot and change what he had done. But he could decide that walking away would not be the final choice he made. When Monique returned from the bank, she tried to make her face look normal before opening the apartment door. Gwendolyn had already brought the children home, and Deshaun was sitting at the kitchen table with one hand resting against his swollen cheek. Kesha was coloring beside him. Monique hung the borrowed blazer carefully over a chair and placed the yellow envelope on the counter. Neither child asked what happened right away, but Deshaun watched the envelope as if the answer might be written on the outside. Monique told them the bank had not been able to help yet. She used the word yet because it left room for hope, even though she had no idea what she would try next. Kesha accepted the answer and returned to her crayons. Deshawn remained quiet. He had learned that adults often added the word "yet" when the truth was too painful to say all at once. A few minutes later, Deshawn went into the bedroom and returned carrying a small glass jar. It held the coins he had saved from birthdays, loose change, and the few dollars Gwendolyn sometimes gave him for helping carry groceries. He poured everything onto the table and counted it twice. There were 37 coins and several folded bills, totaling $8.37. It was all the money he owned. "I know it isn't enough," he said, pushing the money toward his mother, "but you can take it first." Monique looked at the coins spread across the table. She knew he had been saving for an art set with real colored pencils instead of the short, broken crayons he used at school. He had talked about it for months and had even drawn a picture of the box he wanted. Monique gently pushed the money back toward him and reminded him what it was for. Deshawn did not touch it. "My tooth only hurts when I eat," he said. "You hurt, even when you're sitting still." Monique had kept herself together inside the bank, on the bus, and all the way up the apartment stairs. That one sentence took away the last bit of strength she had left. She pulled Deshawn into her arms and began to cry. She tried to turn her face so he would not see, but he held on tighter. For the first time, she allowed her son to know that she was scared. Deshawn did not tell her to stop crying. He simply rested his head against her shoulder and waited. His cheek was warm against her neck. Monique hated that he had become so good at comforting other people. A child his age should have been asking for toys, complaining about homework, or arguing with his sister. He should not have been offering his savings to pay for his own pain. That night, Monique rubbed clove oil along Deshawn's swollen gum until his body relaxed. Kesha climbed into bed beside him and placed a folded piece of paper under his pillow. She thought no one had seen her. After both children fell asleep, Monique returned to the room and found the note. The letters were uneven, and several words were spelled the way they sounded. "Please don't take my brother's tooth. My mama doesn't have enough money to buy him another one." Monique sat on the edge of the bed with the note in her hands. Kesha believed the tooth fairy might take Deshawn's broken tooth and leave them with another problem they could not afford. Monique looked at her children sleeping beside each other, both of them trying in their own way to protect the family. She wished she could take every worry out of their heads and carry it herself. Instead, they had already begun carrying parts of hers. Monique lay down between them and pulled the blanket over all three of them. Deshawn shifted in his sleep and pressed his hand against his cheek. Kesha curled closer to her mother. Monique kissed each child and whispered the promise she had repeated many times before. "Tomorrow, Mama will find a way." She waited until their breathing became slow and even. Then she returned to the kitchen, placed the jar of coins beside the yellow envelope, and sat alone in the dark. The refrigerator hummed behind her, and the unpaid bills were stacked near the sink. She thought about the bank, the dental clinics, the payday loan office, and every door that had already closed. Monique picked up her mother's old envelope and held it against her chest. "But how, Mama?" she whispered. The community clinic opened at 9, but Monique and Deshawn arrived before 7. A line already stretched along the sidewalk. Deshawn stood beside her without complaining, holding a juice box in one hand and pressing the other against his swollen cheek. By the time they were called inside, his face looked worse than it had the day before. The antibiotics had slowed the infection, but they had not stopped it. The doctor examined the broken tooth, then asked Monique to step closer to the X-ray. A dark area had formed beneath the root, dangerously close to the bone. The tooth needed to be removed as soon as possible. If they waited much longer, the infection could spread into Deshawn's jaw or bloodstream. The doctor spoke carefully, but Monique understood the fear behind every word. "You may have 5 days," he told her. "After that, this may become a medical emergency." Monique looked at her son sitting in the examination chair. He was studying a faded poster on the wall, pretending not to listen. 5 days was not a plan. It was a countdown. She thanked the doctor, folded the referral papers, and placed them inside the yellow envelope with all the other documents that had failed to open a door. On the bus ride home, Deshawn rested his head against the window. After several stops, he quietly asked whether Monique was going to lose another job because of him. She turned toward him, shocked that he had been carrying that fear. He reminded her that she had left work after the playground accident and again for the clinic visit. "You will never be the reason I lose anything," Monique said. "But every time I get sick, you have to leave work." Monique took his hand. "Jobs can be replaced. You cannot." Deshawn nodded, but he still looked guilty. Monique hated that her son believed needing his mother came with a price. He had begun treating his own pain like a bill the family could not afford. She pulled him close and told him that children were not supposed to apologize for being sick. Still, she could feel the 5-day deadline following them all the way home. That night, after the children were asleep, Monique walked into a payday loan office several blocks from the apartment. Bright signs in the window promised fast cash with no credit check. The employee barely asked why she needed the money. He only requested identification, proof of income, and access to her checking account. $500 could be available within minutes. Then Monique read the repayment terms. By the time fees and interest were added, she would owe far more than she could afford. Missing one payment would create another fee, and the lender could continue withdrawing money from her account. She knew the numbers were dangerous, but Deshawn had only 5 days. For a moment, the danger waiting next month felt smaller than the danger waiting this week. Monique picked up the pen. At the next desk, another woman was signing over the title to her car. She explained that she needed money for rent and would repay it after her next paycheck. The employee warned that if she fell behind, the company could take the vehicle. The woman signed anyway because she had a child waiting beside her and nowhere else to go. Monique looked at the application in front of her and saw what would happen next. If the lender emptied her account, she could miss rent. If she missed rent, she and the children could lose their home. The $500 might fix Deshawn's tooth while breaking everything else around them. The trap was not hidden. It was simply placed in front of desperate people and called a choice. She tore the application in half and placed the pen on the desk. Outside, the air had turned cold. Monique stood beneath the bright loan sign with no money, no appointment, and 5 days left. Walking away did not feel brave. It felt terrifying. But she knew one thing clearly. She would not save her son from one emergency by handing their entire future to another. Monique held the yellow envelope against her chest and started walking home. 4 days remained. Eric found Monique outside the community clinic the following morning. She stood near the curb with Deshawn beside her and Kesha holding the edge of her coat. Deshawn's left cheek was swollen, and although he tried to stand straight, his body leaned slightly toward his mother. Eric had seen Monique only from a distance at the bank, but he recognized the yellow envelope immediately. He had carried $500 in cash with him because he believed that was the simplest way to solve the problem. For several minutes, Eric remained beside his car, unsure whether to approach. He remembered walking away from her at the bus stop and knew that doing nothing again would be easier. This time, he crossed the street. Deshawn watched him carefully as he stopped a few feet from Monique. Eric introduced himself and explained that he had been sitting in the cubicle beside hers at the bank. Monique's expression changed as soon as she understood. She held the yellow envelope tighter against her body. The private conversation she had struggled to survive had not been private at all. A stranger had heard her explain her credit, her unpaid bills, and her son's pain. For a moment, embarrassment passed across her face, but it quickly became anger. Eric told her he had not meant to listen. He said the walls were thin and that her story had stayed with him. Then he took a white envelope from his coat and held it out. Inside was exactly $500. "I only want your son to get the treatment he needs," Eric said. Monique looked at the envelope, but did not reach for it. She glanced at Deshawn, who was listening even though he pretended to watch the traffic. Then she looked back at Eric. "You heard me during one of the worst moments of my life, and now you think giving me money will make you a good man?" Eric lowered his hand. He had expected hesitation, perhaps pride, but not the truth spoken so directly. He explained that the money was not a loan and that she would not have to repay it. He thought removing the obligation would make the offer easier to accept. Instead, Monique's face became harder. "That makes it worse," she said. "You know nothing about me except that I was denied. You don't know how I got that credit score or how many years I've spent paying debts that were never mine. You heard one conversation and decided what kind of help I should accept." Eric had spent his career solving problems quickly. When a project lacked money, he found investors. When construction fell behind, he hired more workers. He was used to being thanked for removing obstacles. Standing in front of Monique, he began to understand that he had approached her the same way he approached a damaged building. He had seen a problem and assumed money gave him the right to control the repair. Monique placed one hand on Deshawn's shoulder. "If you really care about my son, then see him as a child. Don't use him as a chance to fix something from your past." The words struck Eric because they were true. He had heard Beverly's voice in Monique's bank cubicle. He had carried the cash because he wanted to do for Monique what he had never been able to do for his mother. But Monique was not Beverly, and Deshawn was not the frightened 10-year-old Eric had once been. His regret belonged to him. It was not their responsibility to heal it. Eric returned the envelope to his coat. "Then tell me what I should have done." Monique looked toward the clinic, where more families were still waiting outside. Some had arrived before sunrise. A mother held a sleeping child against her chest, while an older man sat in a wheelchair with a bag of medication on his lap. None of them needed a wealthy stranger to appear once, hand them money, and disappear. They needed a system that did not make every emergency more expensive because they were poor. "You could pay for my son today," Monique said. "Tomorrow, another mother will sit in that same bank cubicle and hear the same answer. What happens to her child?" Eric had no response. $500 could help Deshawn, but it would not change what happened when the next person needed $600 for rent, $400 for medicine, or $700 to repair the car that took them to work. The bank had not denied Monique because no one had $500. It denied her because helping people in her situation was not profitable enough. Monique told him she did not want charity. She wanted a fair way to borrow the money, repay it, and rebuild the credit that had been damaged without her consent. She wanted her name on the agreement and proof that she had kept her promise. Most of all, she wanted the next person to have the same chance without depending on whether a rich man happened to be sitting behind the right wall. Deshawn gently pulled at his mother's sleeve and asked whether they could go home. His face had grown pale and the pain was returning. Monique placed an arm around him and started toward the bus stop. Before leaving, she looked back at Eric. "Help should not depend on someone being lucky enough for you to overhear them." Eric remained on the sidewalk as Monique walked away with her children. The cash was still in his pocket, but it now felt useless. He had arrived believing $500 would make him part of the solution. Instead, Monique had shown him that he was trying to make himself feel better without changing the thing that had hurt her. For the first time, Eric understood the difference between saving one person and removing the reason they needed to be saved. He watched Monique help Deshawn onto the bus. Then he turned toward the bank, no longer carrying an offer. He was carrying a question. Brianna came home 2 days later. Eric hadn't asked her to fly across the country, but after hearing the strain in his voice, she booked the first flight she could afford. When she entered his apartment, the 6 chairs were still lined neatly around the dining table. Eric had ordered dinner, but neither of them touched it. He told her about the bank, Monique's son, the envelope of cash, and the way Monique had refused him on the sidewalk. He also admitted that he had asked his attorney to look into Monique's financial history. He said he wanted to understand how someone with 2 jobs and a repayment plan could end up with a credit score of 503. Brianna's expression changed. She asked whether Monique had given him permission to investigate her. Eric said no, but insisted he had only wanted to help. "You heard a painful part of her life through a wall," Brianna said. "Then you went looking for the rest without asking her." Eric tried to explain that his attorney might be able to challenge the fraudulent debt. He believed access to legal help could change Monique's situation. Brianna understood that, but she also saw the pattern her father did not. Whenever Eric felt helpless, he turned people into problems he could study, finance, and manage. It was easier for him to build a plan than to ask what another person actually wanted. "Don't build a monument to your generosity and put yourself in the center of it," Brianna told him. Eric looked at the untouched food between them. "Then what am I supposed to do?" "Ask the person who is trapped which direction the door should open." Her words stayed with him. Monique had already told him what she needed. She did not want cash from a stranger. She wanted a fair loan in her own name and a chance to repair the damage done to her credit. She also wanted the next family to have somewhere to turn. Eric had been so focused on helping Monique that he had almost ignored the larger problem she was pointing toward. The next morning, Eric returned to the bank and met with the branch manager. He asked how many applications under $1,000 were denied each month. The manager explained that small loans cost nearly as much to process as larger ones, but brought in very little profit. Applicants with poor credit were considered too risky, especially when they had no savings or property. From the bank's point of view, the system was working as designed. Eric understood the numbers. He had built his career around risk, financing, and return. He also understood what the numbers left out. The bank could approve millions for a developer because the transaction was profitable. It could not justify lending $500 to a mother trying to keep an infection from spreading through her child's body. The problem was not a lack of money. The problem was that people like Monique did not produce enough profit to be worth the bank's effort. Eric offered to place his own money into a guarantee account. The fund would cover emergency loans below $1,000. For applicants rejected by the standard system, the loans would carry no interest and could be repaid over 12 months. Instead of relying only on a credit score, the bank would consider income, the reason for the emergency, and a realistic repayment plan. If someone defaulted, the loss would come from Eric's guarantee fund rather than the bank. The branch manager listened, then began talking about legal review, compliance rules, and administrative costs. Eric expected resistance. This time, however, he did not demand that the bank simply make an exception for Monique. He asked them to create a process that could remain after her case was over. He was willing to finance the risk, but he wanted the program to belong to the community, not to him. The bank's public relations director suggested naming it the Johnson Emergency Fund. Eric refused. He did not want his name on the applications, the office walls, or the news release. The program was not supposed to celebrate the person who supplied the money. It was supposed to give people a way to keep their dignity while receiving help. That afternoon, Eric returned to Monique's apartment. He did not carry cash. He brought only a short proposal explaining the program in plain language. Gwendolyn watched him carefully from the doorway while Monique read the pages at her kitchen table. Deshawn was resting in the bedroom, and the sound of Kesha's crayons moving across paper filled the quiet apartment. Eric explained that the bank had not approved the program yet, but the manager had agreed to move it through legal review. If accepted, Monique could become the first borrower. The $500 would be issued as a real loan, with her name on every document. Each payment would be reported so she could begin rebuilding the credit history that had been taken from her. Monique read the proposal twice. She wanted to believe it could work, but she had learned not to trust promises made by people who could leave whenever the situation became difficult. She asked what would happen after Deshawn received treatment. Eric said the fund would remain available to other applicants. Monique asked whether the bank planned to use her story for advertising. Eric admitted they had suggested it, but he had refused to agree to anything without her permission. Monique placed the papers on the table and gave him 3 conditions. The money had to be a legitimate loan in her name, not a private gift hidden behind bank paperwork. Her story and her children's names could not be shared publicly unless she approved every detail. Most importantly, the program had to remain open to other families after her loan was repaid. She would not allow her son's pain to become a temporary campaign that disappeared once Eric felt better about himself. Eric agreed to all 3 conditions. "I thought I was coming here to open a door for you," he said. Monique looked at him across the small kitchen table. "No, you only need to stop standing in front of it." Eric did not defend himself. He understood that wealth had taught him to believe every closed door needed his hand on the handle. Monique was showing him something different. She did not need him to lead her through. She needed access to a system that had been built to keep people like her outside. Before Eric left, Deshawn came into the kitchen. His face looked pale, and one hand was pressed against his cheek. He asked whether the papers meant the dentist could help him. Monique looked at Eric, then back at her son. She did not promise more than she knew. "It means some people are finally trying to make room for us," she said. Deshawn nodded and returned to the bedroom. Eric watched him walk away and felt the weight of the 5-day deadline. The program still had to pass legal review, and Monique's son did not have time for long meetings. Eric knew the next step could not be another grand gesture. It had to be practical, fast, and guided by what Monique had asked for. When he reached the hallway, Brianna's words returned to him. "Do not build a monument to your generosity." For the first time, Eric understood that helping did not mean becoming the hero of someone else's story. Sometimes it meant giving up control, stepping aside, and making sure the door stayed open after you were gone. The attorneys began reviewing Monique's credit records as soon as she gave them permission. They found 4 credit cards and a personal loan opened during her marriage, all carrying signatures that looked similar but did not match the way she normally signed her name. For the first time in 3 years, someone was not asking Monique to prove that she was innocent before agreeing to listen. The legal team contacted the lenders, requested the original applications, and prepared an identity theft report. 2 days later, Darius called her. Monique had not heard his voice in months. He began by asking about Deshawn and Kesha, speaking gently as if he were a concerned father who had simply been busy. He asked whether Deshawn's tooth was better and whether Kesha still liked to draw on the walls. Monique knew he had not called to check on the children. Darius only became kind when he wanted something, and the softer his voice became, the more carefully she listened. He told her that an attorney had contacted one of his former employers. Then he accused her of trying to destroy his life over financial decisions they had supposedly made together. Monique stood at the kitchen counter while the children played in the bedroom, keeping her voice low so they would not hear. Darius reminded her that custody agreements could be changed. He said a judge might question whether a woman working 2 part-time jobs and living in a 1-bedroom apartment could properly support 2 children. "Do you really want them standing in a courtroom watching their father get arrested?" he asked. Monique tightened her hand around the phone. "They've watched their mother pay for your crimes for 3 years. That is what they never should have seen." Darius became silent for a moment. Then the kindness disappeared from his voice. He warned her that court cases were expensive, public, and painful for children. He said Deshawn might be forced to answer questions, and Kesha might grow up believing her mother had sent her father to jail. Every sentence was designed to make Monique feel responsible for the consequences of his actions. It was the same thing he had done during their marriage. He created the damage, then convinced her that protecting the family meant hiding it. After the call ended, Monique sat at the kitchen table and stared at the yellow envelope. She had imagined that reporting Darius would make her feel stronger. Instead, the old fear returned so quickly that it felt as though he had never left. She pictured her children in a courtroom, confused and frightened while strangers discussed their family. She imagined Darius asking for custody just to punish her, and she wondered whether the truth was worth putting Deshawn and Kesha through another painful fight. That evening, Monique called the attorney and asked what would happen if she withdrew the complaint. The attorney did not pressure her. She explained that the investigation could stop, but the fraudulent debts might remain attached to Monique's name. Darius could also use her silence as evidence that the accounts had been shared or accepted during the marriage. Monique thanked her and said she needed one more night to decide. Gwendolyn found her sitting in the hallway outside the apartment after the children were asleep. Monique told her about Darius's threat and admitted that part of her wanted to let the case disappear. During the marriage, staying quiet had prevented arguments from becoming worse. After Darius left, silence had helped her get through workdays, collection calls, and nights when she did not know how she would pay rent. She had survived by keeping every fear inside and handling one problem at a time. Gwendolyn sat beside her and listened. Then she took Monique's hand. "Silence may have kept the roof from falling once," she said, "but now it's the thing crushing you." Monique looked toward the apartment door. She did not want her children to learn that love meant accepting harm to keep a family together. She had already watched Deshawn hide his toothache because he did not want to become another burden. If she backed away now, he might learn that the person who causes pain should be protected from the truth. Still, knowing what was right did not make her less afraid. The next morning, Deshawn found her sorting old documents at the kitchen table. He asked whether she was looking for something from his father. Monique told him she needed anything showing how Darius handled the family's finances. Deshawn became quiet, then said his father had once taught him how to write Monique's name. Darius had called it a game and told him he could surprise his mother by learning her grown-up signature. Monique stopped moving. Deshawn explained that his father had practiced first, filling several pages before asking him to copy the letters. At the time, Deshawn was too young to understand why Darius needed to practice a name that was not his. He only remembered that his father became angry when the writing did not look right. The notebook had been placed inside a box with old crayons, school papers, and broken toys when they moved apartments. They searched the bedroom closet until they found the box beneath a stack of blankets. Deshawn sat on the floor while Monique removed coloring books, puzzle pieces, and small cars with missing wheels. Near the bottom was a blue notebook with several pages torn out. On the remaining pages, Monique's name appeared over and over again. Some attempts were too large, others leaned in the wrong direction. As the pages continued, the handwriting became closer to her real signature. Darius had practiced the shape of the first letter, the curve of her last name, and the line she placed beneath it. In the corner of one page was Deshawn's childish attempt, uneven and written with a red crayon. Monique held the notebook with both hands. For years, companies had told her the signatures looked real. They treated that similarity as proof that she had opened the accounts. Now, she was holding evidence of how the similarity had been created. The truth had been sitting inside a toy box while she worked 2 jobs to repay the lie. Deshawn looked at his mother's face and began to worry. "Am I in trouble because I wrote your name?" Monique immediately pulled him close. She told him he had done nothing wrong. He had been a small child playing a game with someone he trusted. Darius had used that trust, just as he had used hers. None of it belonged to Deshawn. "Will Dad get in trouble?" he asked. Monique didn't know how to answer without giving him more fear than he could carry. She told him that adults had to take responsibility when they hurt people. Then she reminded him that telling the truth was not the same as hurting someone. The person who made the harmful choice was responsible for what happened afterward. That afternoon, Monique delivered the notebook to the attorney. The handwriting samples could be compared with the credit applications in Darius's other records. The notebook did not guarantee that the case would be easy, but it turned a forgotten childhood memory into evidence that could no longer be dismissed as one person's word against another. Before leaving the attorney's office, Monique signed a statement confirming that she wanted the investigation to continue. Her hand trembled as she wrote her name, but she did not stop. Darius had stolen that signature to create debt, fear, and years of closed doors. This time, Monique used it to take the first step toward holding him responsible. She was still afraid of the courtroom, the questions, and what the fight might cost her family. Courage did not remove any of those fears. It simply meant that fear would no longer make the decision for her. For years, Darius had used Monique's name as a weapon. Now, she was taking it back. Deshaun collapsed during reading class on Thursday morning. His teacher noticed him shivering even though the classroom was warm, and when she touched his forehead, his skin felt hot. Before she could reach the nurse, Deshaun tried to stand and fell beside his desk. The left side of his face was badly swollen, and his breathing had become quick and shallow. The school called an ambulance, then contacted Monique at the motel where she was working. Monique was changing sheets when her phone rang. She almost ignored it because employees were not allowed to take personal calls during a shift, but she recognized the school's number. The nurse told her that Deshaun had a high fever and had lost consciousness for several seconds. By the time the call ended, Monique was already pulling off her cleaning gloves. Her manager blocked the doorway before she could leave. He reminded her that she had already missed hours because of Deshaun's accident, the emergency room visit, and the community clinic. The motel was short-staffed, and another worker would have to finish her rooms. If Monique walked out again, he could not promise that her job would still be waiting the next morning. He did not sound angry. He spoke as though losing her job was simply another rule neither of them could change. For a moment, Monique stood between the bed she had been making and the door leading to her son. She needed that paycheck for rent, groceries, and bus fare. Losing another job could place the entire family in danger. Then she remembered Deshaun asking whether she would lose work because of him. He had already begun believing that his pain was costing his mother too much. Monique untied her apron and placed it on the cleaning cart. "I have already lost too much by staying quiet," she said. "I will not lose my child to protect one shift." Her manager warned her that leaving was her decision. Monique nodded because she understood exactly what he meant. She was choosing her son, but the system would record only that an employee had abandoned her work. It would not record the fever, the infected tooth, or the child who had apologized for needing his mother. Monique walked out without knowing whether she would be allowed to return. At the school, Deshaun was lying in the nurse's office with a cold cloth across his forehead. He opened his eyes when Monique entered and immediately tried to sit up. The first thing he asked was whether she had gotten in trouble at work. Monique sat beside him and took his hand. Even while frightened and sick, he was still worried about the cost of being cared for. "You are not a problem I have to pay for," she told him. "You are my child." Deshaun's eyes filled with tears, but he turned his face toward the wall. Monique had rarely seen him cry since the accident. His silence had always looked like courage, but now she understood that he had been carrying guilt along with the pain. She held him close while the nurse arranged transportation to the hospital. The doctor's 5-day warning had arrived sooner than Monique had feared. News of Deshaun's collapse reached Ms. Patel through the community clinic. The receptionist remembered the emergency loan application and called the bank to ask whether the money had been approved. The program was still being reviewed by the legal department. No funds could be released, and no one could promise when the paperwork would be completed. Ms. Patel stared at the pending file and realized that the bank was carefully discussing rules while a child's infection continued to spread. She called Eric and explained what had happened. Eric immediately offered to pay the surgeon himself, but Ms. Patel reminded him that Monique had already refused private cash. She did not want another act of charity that disappeared after one emergency. She wanted the treatment connected to the program they were trying to build. Eric understood, but Deshaun could not wait for another meeting. For the first time, Ms. Patel stopped accepting pending approval as the end of the conversation. She called dental surgeons across the city and explained that a formal guarantee fund was being reviewed. Most offices refused to schedule treatment without full payment. One surgeon finally agreed to examine the case if the bank provided a written guarantee that the $500 would be paid within 48 hours. The bank could not legally issue the loan yet, but it could provide a temporary payment commitment backed by Eric's guarantee account. Ms. Patel took the proposal to the branch manager and asked him to approve it. He warned that the arrangement was unusual and would require additional documentation. She placed Deshaun's medical referral on his desk and told him that unusual paperwork was still better then an emergency room treating an infection that should have been stopped days earlier. By late afternoon, the guarantee was signed. The surgeon agreed to treat Deshawn the next morning. Ms. Patel called Monique at the hospital and explained that the procedure had been scheduled. For several seconds, Monique said nothing. She had heard so many careful apologies and polite refusals that she did not immediately understand she was finally hearing yes. "Why did it take my son collapsing before someone found a way?" she asked. Ms. Patel had no answer that could make the delay acceptable. She only admitted that the option had always existed, but no one had searched hard enough to find it. The rules had not suddenly changed. A person inside the system had simply decided that repeating them was no longer enough. Monique looked at Deshawn sleeping beside her with an IV in his arm. She thanked Ms. Patel, but this time the words did not come from defeat. They came from the small relief of knowing her child would finally receive treatment. The fight was not over, and she might no longer have a job to return to, but the countdown had stopped. For days, everyone had waited for a door to open. Ms. Patel had finally understood that sometimes a closed door did not need to be broken. Someone simply had to care enough to look for the key. The next morning, Deshawn sat on the hospital bed wearing a gown that was too large for him. He tried to act calm, but his fingers kept twisting the edge of the blanket. Monique stayed beside him, answering every question and hiding her own fear behind a steady voice. Eric waited near the door, unsure whether he belonged there, but unwilling to leave. When the nurse arrived to take Deshawn into surgery, he reached for his mother's hand. Then he looked at Eric. "Can you sit beside my mom? Whenever I hurt, she holds my hand. Today, she doesn't have a hand to hold." Monique tried to smile, but her face began to break. Eric nodded and promised he would stay. The doors closed behind Deshawn, leaving Monique and Eric alone in the hallway. The surgeon had said the procedure would take about 22 minutes. Monique sat with her hands locked together, watching the clock move too slowly. Eric did not tell her everything would be fine, because he could not promise something he did not know. Instead, he sat beside her and said, "You don't have to be strong for the next 22 minutes." Monique lowered her head, and the tears she had held back for weeks finally came. She cried for the nights Deshawn had slept in pain, the 7 clinics that could not help him, the job she might have lost, and the bank that had reduced her life to a number. Eric remained quiet while she gripped his hand. She did not need advice or another plan. She only needed someone to stay. As Eric sat there, he thought of his mother, Beverly. She had hidden her heart condition until it was too late, and she had died without him beside her. He had spent years wishing he could return to that moment and hold her hand. He could not change the past, but this time he would not walk away from someone who was afraid. The operating room doors opened 22 minutes later. The surgeon told them the tooth had been removed and the infection cleaned before it could spread further. Monique covered her mouth and closed her eyes. Her knees weakened with relief, and Eric placed a hand beneath her arm to steady her. When Deshawn woke, his speech was still slow from the anesthesia. Monique leaned close, afraid he might still be hurting. He opened his eyes and whispered, "Mama, it doesn't hurt anymore." Monique kissed his forehead and began to cry again. This time, her tears were not from fear or helplessness. They came because her son was finally safe. For the first time in weeks, Deshawn smiled without hiding one side of his face. 5 days after the bank denied her, Monique returned to the same cubicle. Deshawn was home recovering, and the swelling in his face had finally begun to fade. She wore her own clothes this time, not Gwendolyn's borrowed blazer. The yellow envelope rested in her lap, holding the same documents that had once failed to prove she deserved help. Ms. Patel turned away from the computer and looked directly at Monique. There was no practiced smile this time. "That morning, I let a number speak for you," she said. Monique placed her hands on the desk. "Then from now on, before you read the number, ask the person sitting in front of you what happened to them." The emergency loan was for $500, with no interest and 12 months to repay it. It was a small amount to the bank, but to Monique it meant more than a paid dental bill. The agreement gave her a chance to repay the money in her own name and begin rebuilding the financial history Darius had stolen. For once, the system was recording what she had actually chosen. Ms. Patel placed the final document in front of her. Monique picked up the pen, but her hand stopped above the signature line. For years, her name had appeared on bills, accounts, and debts she had never approved. A man she trusted had copied her signature and turned it into evidence against her. Monique slowly wrote her name. She paused before finishing the final stroke, then looked at the ink on the page. "This is my signature," she said. "This time no one gets to use it except me." Ms. Patel stamped the agreement and handed Monique a copy. Monique placed it inside the yellow envelope beside the hospital records and her children's birth certificates. The envelope no longer held only proof of what had gone wrong. It now carried the first document showing that she was taking control of her name again. The bank's public relations team asked Eric to pose for a photograph while presenting the first loan. They wanted him standing beside Monique, holding the check and smiling for the camera. Eric refused. Monique's son had nearly died, while people inside the bank followed procedures and looked away. Turning that pain into an advertisement would only repeat the same mistake in a different form. "This program did not begin because I was generous," Eric told them. "It began because all of us once refused to look." There was no photograph and no large check. Monique simply left the bank carrying her yellow envelope. This time, when she reached the glass doors, she did not stop to gather the strength to face another rejection. She pushed the door open and walked through. Darius arrived at the hearing in a dark suit, carrying himself like a man who had nothing to hide. He denied opening the accounts and claimed Monique had known about every loan. Then he described her as emotional, careless with money, and angry over the divorce. Years earlier, those words would have made Monique question her own memory. This time she kept her eyes on him and did not look away. For most of their marriage, Darius had controlled every difficult conversation. He spoke calmly while Monique became upset, then used her emotions as proof that she could not be trusted. He tried the same thing in court, answering questions with confidence and acting as if the hearing were another problem he could talk his way out of. But Monique was no longer standing alone in their kitchen. The truth was now written across years of records. When it was her turn to speak, Monique carried the yellow envelope to the table. She removed each document slowly. The fraudulent credit applications, collection notices, payment records, handwriting comparisons, and the notebook found in Deshawn's toy box. Page after page showed Darius practicing her name until the signature looked almost real. The same name that had once been used against her was now helping prove what he had done. Monique placed her credit report beside the forged applications. "For 3 years, I have been forced to prove that I am not the woman these papers describe," she said. "Today, I am not asking anyone to believe me simply because I say I was wronged. I am asking that the evidence finally be entered into the record." Darius looked at the notebook and, for the first time, lost his calm expression. His attorney tried to suggest that anyone could have written the signatures, but the pages showed the work becoming more accurate over time. The dates matched the period when the accounts had been opened. The evidence did not erase the years Monique had lost, but it finally placed responsibility where it belonged. The judge ordered the fraudulent debts reviewed and referred the evidence for further investigation. The case was not completely over, but Monique's name was no longer treated as proof of guilt. When she left the courtroom, she carried the yellow envelope differently. It no longer felt like a weight against her chest. It felt like something she had survived. Deshawn had been waiting outside with Gwendolyn. As they walked down the courthouse steps, he quietly asked whether his father was a bad person. Monique stopped and knelt in front of him. She did not want to lie, but she also did not want her son to believe He had inherited the harm his father had caused. "Your father made choices that hurt our family, and he has to answer for them," she said. "But his mistakes do not belong to you." Deshawn looked at the envelope in her hands. "Do they still belong to you?" Monique thought about the money she had paid, the jobs she had lost, and every room where strangers had judged her by a stolen number. Those things had happened to her, but they no longer defined her. "Not anymore," she said. Deshawn took her hand, and they continued down the steps together. Behind them, the courthouse doors closed on the man who had used Monique's name as a weapon. Ahead of them was a life where she would no longer carry his debt, his shame, or his version of the truth. Over the next several months, the fraudulent accounts were removed from Monique's credit report one by one. Her score began to rise, and an accounting firm hired her as a bookkeeper after seeing the experience she had never lost. She also joined the advisory board for the bank's emergency lending program, where she helped review applications from people the old system would have rejected. 4 months after Deshawn's surgery, she made the final payment on the $500 loan. She placed the receipt inside the yellow envelope beside her children's birth certificates and her mother's death certificate. The envelope had once carried proof of debt, loss, and betrayal. Now it also held evidence that Monique had kept a promise made in her own name. She thought about Odessa and the rule her mother had lived by: never ask, always find another way. Monique still believed in finding a way, but she no longer believed every road had to be walked alone. She wanted her children to know that asking for help did not make a person weak. Eric began changing his life in quieter ways. One evening, he invited Brianna home for dinner and left his phone in another room. He did not mention business, check the time, or plan when the evening should end. Brianna pulled out one of the chairs that had remained untouched for years and asked why he still kept all 6. Eric looked around the table and said, "I keep hoping this home will become a place where someone wants to stay longer than 10 minutes. Brianna smiled and remained until late that night. They talked about the school concert he had missed, the years after the divorce, and the apologies Eric had always tried to replace with money. He listened without defending himself. Nothing between them was repaired in a single dinner, but one of the empty chairs was no longer empty. For Eric, that was enough to begin. At school, Deshawn entered an architecture competition with a model of the house he had drawn for years. It had 2 stories, a porch, a tree, and 4 upstairs windows glowing with small yellow lights. On the first floor, he added a large room with a sign above the door, a place where people are heard before they are judged. His teacher noticed that the room had no partitions and asked why. Deshawn answered, "Some walls protect people from the rain. Other walls keep people from seeing each other." Several weeks later, another young mother entered the bank carrying a folder against her chest. She sat across from Monique and struggled to explain why she needed a $700 emergency loan. Monique did not immediately turn toward the computer. Instead, she moved the tissue box aside so nothing stood between them and said, "Before we discuss your credit score, tell me what brought you here." The woman looked surprised. "Aren't you going to ask whether I can repay it?" Monique nodded and told her that question would come later. "First, I want to understand what it already cost you to sit in this chair." The woman lowered her head and began to cry, not because she had been rejected, but because someone had finally asked what had happened. Outside the glass doors, Deshawn was waiting for his mother. The swelling was gone, and when he saw her looking at him, he smiled with his whole face. Monique glanced at the old yellow envelope resting on her desk. It had once contained proof of everything taken from her. Now it carried proof that a person could reclaim her name, her choices, and the right to be seen as more than a number. Some people do not need to be rescued. They simply need the world to stop placing more stones on a road they are already walking alone.